Welcome to Rainy Day Rabbit Holes, where we take the history of the West off the rails.
If you like your history unhinged, you are in the right place.
I'm Shay.
And I'm Jody.
Let's fall down the rabbit hole. Well, hey, rabbit holers. It's your girl Shay here. And this week, the last official week of summer, we are playing something very special for you. So y'all know we have the Umbrella Podcast Collective, and one of our fabulous members is Dark History, or The Darkness Sees the Light. And he did an incredible episode all about something that you have heard us talk about. He dove deep into one of the most chilling and overlooked forms of human trafficking in history, Shanghaiing. So you heard us talk about it with the girls from P&W Haunts and Homicides, where we talked about the Shanghai Tunnels in Portland. Well, he dives deep into Portland, San Francisco, and even Liverpool. In this episode, you'll not only hear about the history of Shanghaiing, you'll hear the real names behind the crimes, like the notorious Bunko Kelly, and he will uncover how this brutal system thrived in plain sight for decades. So take a listen, and then make sure to go over and follow Dark History. See you down the rabbit hole.
The sailor had no memory. One minute he was walking along the docks in Portland, counting the few coins he'd earned, hauling cargo for a Norwegian steamer. He hadn't eaten since the morning. His clothes were damp, his boots soaked through from the rain. A warm room, a cheap drink, just one, and he figured he'd be back in the boarding house before dark. That was the last memory he had. The next thing he knew, he was choking on dry air, blinking against the glare of daylight. Head split open like he'd been kicked. His mouth tasted like copper and cheap rum. His shirt was soaked in sweat. He was lying on a rough canvas bunk in a cramped cabin. The walls creaked. Everything swayed. He rolled over and threw up. The stink of bilge, rope tar, and unwashed men filtered his lungs. He heard shouting. Orders barked in a voice he did not recognize. He scrambled to his feet, staggered down a narrow passageway, climbed a ladder, and shoved open the hatch. Nothing but open ocean. No land in sight. No clue how long he'd been out. Just a cry of gulls, the wind snipping the sails, and a crew of strangers who barely glanced at him as he stirred around, wide-eyed and swaying. He had been shanghaied. There was no contract, no payment, no agreement. He wasn't part of the crew because he wanted to be. He was property now. The ship was bound for Asia, likely Manila or Shanghai. If he refused to work, he'd be flogged. If he collapsed, he'd be thrown overboard. And that was the reality of thousands during the 19th and early 20th century. Shanghaiing wasn't some isolated scam pulled by handfuls of crooks. It was a system, a trade. Port cities needed sailors, and merchant captains paid well to get them, no questions asked. Crimps stepped in to fill the gaps, grabbing men however they could. Some were drugged, some were knocked unconscious in alleys, some were fed lies on false contracts, some just vanished. The networks behind it were wide. Entire blocks were in on it. Bartenders, boarding house keepers, ship's officers, even the police. Some victims were sold by people they trusted. Others were betrayed by strangers who bought them a drink. The lines between victim, bystander, and accomplice blurred in the port cities, where life was cheap and silence could be bought. Many never returned. Those who did come back changed, if they came back at all. Some escaped by jumping ship at foreign ports. Others waited for years for a sympathetic captain or a lucky break. The rest ended up buried at sea, or rotting on remote island beaches, unnamed and forgotten. The men who ran these operations were called Crimps. They didn't lurk in back alleys, they owned businesses. They ran entire blocks. Some were respected figures, until you looked too closely. Today we're going to examine how they operated, how they were allowed to thrive, and what happened to the people who vanished into the waves. You'll hear real methods and names of those involved, and the full picture of how Shanghaiing worked, how thousands were taken from familiar streets and found themselves trapped on a ship they couldn't leave. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Dark History Podcast, where we explore the darkest parts of human history. Hope everybody is doing well. I'm Rob, your host as always, and you're listening to Season 4, Episode 11. Before we start, I want to say a big thank you to Deli for your lovely message on Buzzsprout's fan mail. I really appreciate it that you took the time to reach out and like the Boots episode from a few months ago. So, today we're going back to the age of sail, but not the version you've heard in stories. No adventure, no treasure hunt, no heroic captains. This isn't Pirates of the Caribbean. What we're talking about was brutal, often forgotten, and completely real. This was Shanghaiing, organised human trafficking, carried out in full view, in broad daylight, and it went on for nearly a century. From the mid-1800s into the early 20th century, entire districts in port cities like San Francisco, Portland and Liverpool revolved around it. It wasn't a secret. Everyone knew it happened. Everyone knew who was doing it. And still, it continued. People disappeared off the streets. Not just the drunk or the desperate. Labourers looking for work. Immigrants who didn't speak the language. Sailors who'd just come ashore to rest. Some were handed a drink and never woke up. Some were clubbed in alleys and dragged into cellars. Others were handed over by their landlords, or so-called friends, sold for a quick fee. There were no rules. If you were alone, broke and breathing, you were a target. And once you were taken, nobody came looking. You woke up at sea, and your whole life was gone. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how the trade worked, how long it lasted, and how eventually it ended. And you'll hear the names of the men who ran it, men who got rich, while others vanished into the ocean. So without further ado, let's tie down the rigging and set sail for more dark history. Shanghaiing, or crimping as it was often called, became widespread by the mid-1800s, particularly during the gold rush. It started with a simple problem. Sailing ships were coming in and out of port constantly, but nobody wanted to work on them. Conditions aboard were awful. Long hours, low pay, brutal discipline, spoiled food, no safety, and no way to leave once you set sail. Crewing a merchant ship wasn't a job, it was a sentence. But ships couldn't leave port without a crew. If they sat too long, the cargo spoiled, or the buyers backed out. Time was money, and captains were under pressure to get moving. So they paid someone else to solve the problem. That's where the Crimps came in. Crimps were middlemen. The captains paid them per sailor delivered, sometimes up front. That meant every unconscious man dragged onto the ship was worth a payout. This turned human trafficking into a functional business. The more men you rounded up, the more you earned. There was no need to ask questions, no contracts, no consent, just bodies. Some crimps ran boarding houses. They'd lure sailors and labourers in with cheap rent and a promise of work, then lock the door at night and sell the guests off when the ships needed crew. Others worked with brothels or saloons, where drinks were drugged. Ether, chloral hydrate, laudanum, opium, whatever worked. A few bars even had trapdoors built in the floor. Once the victim passed out, they were dropped straight into the basement and hauled off without ever waking up. Nowhere was more organised than in Portland, Oregon. Beneath Portland's downtown is a network of interconnected basements, tunnels and storage corridors, now known as the Shanghai Tunnels. Originally, they were part of the city's freight and steam heating system. They allowed workers to move goods from the docks directly into businesses without blocking up the busy streets. But over time, that infrastructure was repurposed. Bars, hotels and brothels started using the tunnels to move people. A man would walk into a saloon near the river, have a drink and wake up on a ship heading to China. In many cases, he wouldn't even make it out of the bar under his own power. Some businesses installed trapdoors that led into the tunnels. A Crimps team waited below. Once the mark collapsed, they pulled him through the floor, dragged him underground, and kept him in a holding cell until the ships were ready. Some of those tunnel holding cells are still intact. Tiny brick rooms with iron bars and no windows. Crimps would chain drugged victims in place, so they didn't escape or wake up and run. Sometimes they kept them for days. In some cases, victims were stripped of ID, belongings and boots, anything that might slow them down or make it easier to flee. And this wasn't just a criminal underground operation in secret. Many local businesses were involved. Some bar owners were paid a flat rate for every man delivered. Others worked on commission. There are records of hotel staff being in on it, steering guests to rooms closest to the tunnel drop point. Some companies even had secret passageways running behind false walls or under staircases, designed specifically for moving victims into tunnels unnoticed. Portland police at the time were either on the take or looking the other way. Some officers actively helped Crimps by refusing to investigate disappearances or making arrests that ended in men quietly disappearing from a jail cell and waking up on a ship. Other officials denied anything was happening, despite public rumours and reports in local papers. The system worked because everybody got paid. Captains got their crew, Crimps got their fee, business owners got a cut, and the victims didn't have a voice. Most were poor, many were immigrants, few had families nearby to raise alarm. Some didn't speak English, others were already half lost to drink or desperate for work. They vanished without a trace. In the worst cases, men were shanghaied repeatedly. If they escaped and returned to shore, they risked getting picked up again. Some eventually gave up and accepted the sea as their life. Others died in transit, never waking up from the knockout drugs or being beaten to death when they refused to work. There are accounts of men being dumped overboard mid-journey, considered too much trouble to keep alive. The tunnels in Portland became notorious over time. Locals knew what they were. Some businesses bragged about their connections. Others pretended it wasn't happening. Today, parts of those tunnels are open to the public. You can walk through them, see the bad cells, the passageways under what is now tourist shops and restaurants. Many of the buildings above still stand. Some of the bars still operate, though the trapdoors are sealed. What makes Portland's system stand out isn't just the scale, it's how open it was. There was no need for secrecy when nobody in power cared. Shanghaiing thrived in places where laws were flexible, people were expendable, and money kept the machine running. This wasn't petty crime. It was infrastructure, designed, maintained and kept in motion for decades. One of the most notorious figures in the history of Shanghaiing was Joseph Bunko Kelly. He worked the docks of Portland in the late 19th century and claimed to have shanghaied over 1,000 men in his career. Most of what we know about him comes from his own account. He wrote a book in 1908 full of stories that sounded like they should be lies, but enough of them lined up with other reports to make you wonder. His most infamous story. In 1893, Kelly said he delivered 50 men to a ship in one night. Except they weren't men. Not living ones anyway. Kelly claimed that while looking for fresh recruits, he wandered into a mortuary where unclaimed bodies were being stored. He loaded them into carts, hauled them down to the docks, and brought them aboard a waiting vessel. The crew was drunk. Nobody checked. Kelly got paid his fee per head and left town before the captain sobered up and realised he'd been conned with a hold full of corpses. It sounds absurd, but it fits the pattern of the time. Crimps got paid per body. The state of those bodies wasn't always questioned. Another of Kelly's stories involves a group of men from the countryside who were new to Portland. He convinced them that they were buying tickets to a theatre show, gave them drinks, then locked them in a cellar overnight. The next morning they woke up on a ship, bound for Shanghai. By the time they'd realised what was happening, they were a week out to sea. Kelly wasn't the only one. Portland had an entire system supporting this. You still hear locals talk about the tunnel myth of Portland Shanghai Tunnels. And sure, some parts of the story have been exaggerated over time, but a lot of it is true. City records, maps and surviving architecture confirm the bars really did have trapdoors leading to the tunnel networks. Trapdoors in the floor would drop the drunk customers straight into the basement. From there, it was a short drag through the tunnels to the docks. Some bars even install fake walls to hide holding pens. A less theatrical but just as effective method was paperwork. The boarding house contract scam was common across American port cities. A man down on his luck would be offered a free bed for the night and maybe a hot meal. What he didn't realise was he'd signed a contract, sometimes forged, sometimes obtained while drunk, agreeing to work on a merchant ship. A thumbprint was enough in some cases. The law backed it. Once the Crimps had the paperwork, the man was property, at least as far as the shipping company was concerned. This wasn't just Portland's problem. San Francisco was just as bad, maybe worse. Crimping there had become an industry. Entire storefronts advertised able-bodied men available now, like they were selling livestock. Competition between crimps got violent. Gangs fought over dock territory, and some crimps maintained private muscle to enforce their control. Captains would come ashore and start bidding wars for crews, knowing full well most of the men they were buying didn't want to be there. One crimp in San Francisco, Johnny Devine, used to lure drunk men from bars using a wagon with false walls. He'd collect them over the course of an evening, stacking them like cargo and delivering them in bulk. His favourite technique was to target men who were already unsteady on their feet. He knew the difference between drunk and unconscious, and if someone protested, his crew just knocked them out and loaded them anyway. Even up the coast in Astoria, Oregon, another crimp, Jim Shanghai Brown, gained a reputation for being creative. His favourite method was to hire young, desperate men for dock work, then led them down to the ships with a promise of cash at the end of the day. Once they were on board, the ship would sail, Brown got paid, and the victims disappeared. Not everyone stayed gone. A few escaped. In 1904, a man named Thomas Griffin made it back to Portland 2 years after being shanghaied. He told reporters how he'd been drugged, beaten, and sent to sea against his will. When the ship docked in Hong Kong, he jumped overboard, swam ashore, and lived rough until he found passage back. He returned with scars and broken teeth, and no justice. The authorities never followed up. Most victims didn't get that lucky. They either vanished completely or spent years at sea, sold from ship to ship like tools. Crimps didn't care. As long as somebody was paying them, they'd sell you into the worst years of your life without blinking, and there was no shortage of buyers. Shanghaiing didn't disappear overnight. It collapsed in pieces, dragged down by slow reform, changing technology, and public embarrassment. By the end of the 19th century, the worst of it had already cracked. Not because the system suddenly grew unconscious, but it was because it stopped being profitable. One of the first major blows came in the 1870s and the 1880s, when maritime labour laws started to tighten. In the US, the Shipping Commissioners Act of 1872 made it illegal for captains to take on sailors without official oversight. Now, a shipping commissioner had to witness the contract. That sounds small, but it broke one of the Crimps' main tools: fake or forged paperwork. It didn't stop all of the fraud, but it created a barrier, and it meant that sailors had someone, at least in theory, looking out for their interests. The next blow hit the wallet. Crimps had always worked for head money, a fee paid per sailor delivered. That created an incentive to lie, trick or drug people onto ships. But by the late 1800s, reformers pushed to the limits or banned these payments. In 1884, the US Congress passed the Dingley Act, which placed stricter rules on how sailors could be recruited and how much money could change hands. More laws followed in the US, the UK, and other countries. It didn't kill Shanghaiing, but it made it more expensive and more risky. Sailors' rights groups grew louder. Maritime unions and advocates pushed hard to expose what was happening in the port cities. They wrote letters to Congress, published pamphlets, and gave speeches. Some went undercover in boarding houses to collect proof. The work got the attention of journalists. By the 1890s, newspapers in New York, San Francisco, and London were publishing stories that laid it all out: how men were taken, where they were held, and who profited. Names were printed. Public anger followed. But even with all that, Shanghaiing didn't truly die until the ships themselves changed. Steam power finished the job. Steamships started to replace sailing vessels in the second half of the 19th century. They were faster, more efficient, and most importantly, less reliant on large crews. A sailing ship might need 30 or 40 men to work the rigging. A steamship could get by with 10 or 15 engineers and firemen. And you couldn't just drug someone and stick them in a boiler room. Steamships needed trained crews. If you put an unskilled, half-conscious man below deck, you risk fire or explosions. That shift made Crimps less useful. Fewer sailors meant fewer paydays. Ships' captains got pickier about who they hired, and steamship companies, bigger and more corporate, were less willing to risk scandal or bad press by hiring trafficked labour. The old port underworld couldn't keep up. By the late 1910s, most of the large-scale Shanghaiing operations had collapsed. Some still lingered in small ports, coastal towns where corruption held on longer, but even those dried up by the 1920s. The last confirmed cases of American sailors being shanghaied was reported in the early 1920s. After that, the term stuck around in slang, but the practice itself mostly disappeared. That doesn't mean the scares vanished. In places like Portland, San Francisco and Liverpool, the stories lived on. The trapdoors in old bars, the tunnels under the city, the rumours about missing men. Tour guides still point out the remnants. Some businesses even trade on the history. Bars with names like Shanghai Tunnel or Crimps Den. It became part of local folklore, a gritty, half-forgotten part of how those cities grew. And the people? The ones taken? Most of their names were never recorded. No compensation. No apologies. Their stories were buried at sea, filed under losses, if they were recorded at all. Shanghaiing didn't end because it was wrong. It ended because it became inconvenient. But its legacy, human trafficking, corruption, abuse in the name of profit, never really went away. It just changed shape. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode. So that was the story of Shanghaiing, a brutal, organised trade in human labour, carried out in broad daylight, often with the full knowledge of the law. For decades it wasn't just allowed, it was expected. A port couldn't run without bodies, and Crimps were the ones who supplied them. How these bodies were found didn't seem to matter. It's part of a much wider pattern. The sea always had its dark corners, and forced recruitment wasn't new. The British Navy, long before Shanghaiing took off, had its own version. Press gangs roamed port cities, looking for men to force into service. One trick was to drop a king's shilling into a drunk man's drink. If he picked up the glass, and the coin touched his lips, it counted as accepted payment, and that was enough to conscript him. Some pubs even started using glass-bottomed tankards, so drinkers could spot the coin before it was too late. By the time the American Crimps were doing their work, the tactics had evolved, but the idea was the same. Find a man alone, get him drunk or knock him out, get him onto a ship before anyone could ask questions. The ship set sail, the money changed hands, and the victim was just another sailor now, whether he wanted to be or not. And it wasn't just always men. In rare cases, women were taken too, often dressed as boys, or pressed into roles as cooks or stewards. Immigrants were easy targets, so were the homeless, so were men running from debts or police. If he vanished from the waterfronts in the 1880s, people just assumed he'd been shanghaied. Sometimes they were right. There are still bars in San Francisco and Portland with sealed trapdoors and hidden cellars. In some places you can walk through those tunnels, now cleaned up for tourists. But the stories they represent aren't just curiosities. They're a reminder of what people will do when money's involved and no one is watching. Shanghaiing is mostly forgotten now. It doesn't fit the heroic image of tall ships and daring captains. But it was part of the maritime world for nearly a century. It kept ships moving. It made people rich. And it left thousands of victims with broken lives, if they were lucky enough to come back at all. Anyway, if you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us reach more listeners by boosting our visibility in the algorithm. If you think friends and family may enjoy the podcast, don't hesitate to share it with them. You'll find all links to socials below. I know ads can sometimes be a pain, so if you'd prefer an ad-free episode, check out our Patreon link, also provided. Supporting us on Patreon is a great way to contribute, but it's entirely optional. We also have a merch store, linked below, where any purchases greatly support the show and help cover production costs. If you've been listening for a while and haven't subscribed yet, please do so. In that way you never miss an episode. Thank you for your support. So with all that out of the way, thank you again for listening. Join us next time for our next episode as we delve into another event and more dark history.